And here we are. So let's look at bad drawings. We love bad drawings. Okay, so here we are. I don't have my chalkboard with me, so I took a couple seconds this morning to quickly sketch it out. So as we often see in my bad drawings, we have that idea of the empire, the regency, which looks like it says Regency. And then we see the romantic next to it. Now, there are about 5 different things that happen visually in silhouette with the romantic, but really, you know, I tend to focus on this kind of what I call the 1830s silhouette more so than sort of some of the others, because it is so romantic. And when we think about that term in costume history of romantic, what are we talking about? We're talking about an exaggeration of the human body that is underneath. And this encapsulates it in many ways. In that when we see the empire for both men and women, what we ultimately see is a very classic silhouette, right? It's following the lines of the body. And with the exception of that higher waist, that sort of foreshortening of the body to that empire line, or that, in the case of the men, that higher line as well. We're really seeing overall a very classic silhouette, you know, and specifically one might say neoclassic. But as I had mentioned, when we get to the end of the empire for women especially, we start to see a ballooning, a filling out. And that leads us to that 1830s silhouette, which is incredibly romantic. If we notice, the sleeves are exceptionally large. The necklines accentuate the sort of breadth across the shoulder. We see a tapering down to what I call a double waistline, because we often will see these sort of belts and such, in which we have kind of that first waistline and then that second waistline. If you think about the directoire, remember when we looked at those sort of the gowns in which we had kind of the emphasis on the bust, and then we had sort of a fit section and then an emphasis on the waist. That belt or that waisting tends to draw in the waist, and with the emphasis at the shoulders and the emphasis at the skirt makes the waist look even smaller. Now, we are going to start getting into that idea of tight lacing or bringing our waistline in, but still not to the degree that we think about when we think about mid century and later of the Victorian era, because now we can start to enter that idea of Victorian, because in 1837, Queen Victoria becomes the Queen of England. And so now we can start to use that term Victorian. If we look at the men, we're also going to see a formalization starting with this development of a new type of jacket or coat. And that coat we call the frock coat. So what does the term frock mean, or how do we use it colloquially?
A dress.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, we use it as a word to mean a dress or some sort of skirted garment. Well, here we're seeing this coat for men start to be called the frock coat, even though we have seen coats that cover up the entirety of the body. But what you'll notice is very similar to the romantic silhouette for women. We're going to see a fitted bodice or a fitted torso for men, with then a fullish skirt. And you can imagine, as we were talking about the sort of separation between men's and women's clothing and how it's created, we can see how tailors would be incredibly necessary for this, because we have to get a very strong fit through the torso, and molding and shaping and padding, and then a cut of the lower part, that peplum, that skirting, to create some fullness. Our idea of breeches by this point have almost completely disappeared except for the most formal occasions. And so that trouser really becomes the point. And these trousers are very thin, very skinny, very similar to, you know, the trouser silhouette that we expect today in some ways, very, very close to the body. And then with boots starting to fall out of favor and shoes becoming more popular, this idea of the stirrup or a sort of connection from the trouser catching under the instep of the shoe becomes very popular. We could see even for men this sort of fullness of the sleeves, which add to those sort of romantic tendencies. Okay. So you get a sense through these bad drawings of how we're going to sort of develop and rethink about clothing. And almost as quickly as these silhouettes balloon out, we're going to see through our slideshow that they start to deflate and I guess, balloon, as we could say, in other areas and work their way down to a return to that kind of fitted bodice like we saw before, a much different sort of balancing of the body within there. Does that kind of make sense? Maybe?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. You know what? Sometimes I just need a little bit of remembrance that there are people out there and I'm not just talking to myself in my craft room, because that's where we are today. We're in my craft room.
We're here.
So it's just nice. It's just nice to hear, you know, voices every once in a while. Okay. Yes, those are patents for the official. That was the first minifigure there. And then this is the patent for the Lego brick. Just something of use. Anyway, they make me happy. Okay, so let's head over to our presentation. So let's get to shared screen and let's get to romantic. Okay, so I am going to go into play mode. And in going into play mode, as I, you know, sort of always say, remember that I have limited view of the chat. And I'm going to minimize this. And I'm going to do that. And hopefully, when we go into play mode, I'll still have a little bit of information there. Excellent. Okay. So here's a little bit of fun, just for whimsy, just for poops and giggles, because as we're going forward, what we're going to see is a strong interest in fashion, and just like today, a mocking also of fashion and the silliness that people are going to see in it. And here we see two fashion plates that are mocking clothes. And if we notice, the thing that they mock the most is kind of the proportion, the shapes that they're seeing. And this is no different than what we do today, right? We have the who wore it better sort of things. We have the you know, we used to call it Mr. Blackwell's list, but even today we'll see sort of the worst dressed. You know, there's Entertainment has sort of made a whole lifetime on how people dress poorly for things like the Oscars and such. So you can see how the silhouettes are truly romantic. And though these are exaggerations, they're really talking about all the different things that they see proportion-wise that are changing. Okay. I'm sure you all feel the same way too, but I like to throw it in every once in a while because this is, you know, this is how we're all handling life today, right? We're fine. I'm fine. You're fine. We're all fine. It's fine.
That's exactly how I feel.
I'm sorry. But I also understand. One of the things I do like to talk about very quickly, because when we were talking about the romantic in the lecture, I want us to be very careful to not confuse romantic with romance. And through all of these historic periods we're talking about, I use art as kind of a window for us to understand where we are as sort of a society. And I have two paintings here that I like to use to sort of talk about the world, because if we look at these portraits, and these are portraits of people in an asylum, we can see a very different take on how artists are going to use art to capture the spirit. And here in this painting by Delacroix, I believe, we see a woman actually wearing men's clothes. If you look very carefully, you can see that there is a man's jacket with that little notch lapel going on there. But we're really focusing in not just on this beauty, not just on, making the world a more perfect place, but kind of struggling with ourselves to figure out who are we. And if you look at this painting and the next one, you're going to see kind of a sadness in the eyes. We always talk about the eyes being sort of the mirror of the soul, and artists are really trying to capture this in this period. Here we see another woman, and though, they're wearing clothes, that's not really the point of what this image is. It's really capturing the human spirit. And how do we do that? And though we're going to see plenty of art that is just pretty for pretty's sake, we're going to be starting a movement to try to internalize and figure out who are we and how can we use art to represent that. We also have to remember that a lot of the literature that is going on, a lot of the music, and a lot of the just sort of joie de vivre is about this sensitivity to the world in general. And that's even why I like that slide, because we also have this sort of complicated understanding of the world because we are so sensitive to the environment and how we ourselves are, in a sense, kind of trapped and kind of misunderstood, I guess, could be the way to think about it. And we'll talk about sickness coming up and how that's kind of a fashionable thing that happens at this time. But where we also compound this into something very complex is this ideal of what we call Orientalism when it comes to art, which is a very unfortunate word. But we see a lot of artists sort of looking to other cultures, not only, and we see this throughout the whole 19th century, not only to appropriate these cultures, but also feel inspired by these cultures. And so we see a number of artists sort of gravitating to other styles and other cultures. And in doing so, sort of involve themselves artistically into the spirit of other worlds. And so there is kind of this dreaminess or this sort of philosophical idea of capturing the past, I guess you could say. So again, let's just think about this and how we sort of move from these sort of static lines, these not even static, but these classic lines into a more romantic silhouette. So here we can see where we were last time, right? If we look at the beginning, we could see 1801, and it's just so slim. And slowly as it moves along, notice that hem. Remember I said focus on that hem, and you can see how adding stuff to it starts to make it much more triangular. And then notice how the puff sleeves start to draw out a bit, adding breadth across the shoulder. And if we look down here, at the bottom, you can see in some ways some volume, some romanticism coming across. And notice how we have an emphasis also again on that diamond-shaped bodice, but also how those sleeves sort of emphasize the slope of the shoulder. And as we move into the 30s, you can see that it's getting very full and broad and diamond shape. Look at that 1934. Can you see how much diamond is in that? And then by the time we move into the 40s, look at 40, 40, 47, you can see almost a return to that restoration style, right? With that deep front bodice and the basque in there, that sort of rounded skirt. And even in the case of that first one on the top, you could see engagement kind of coming back. But we're seeing that sleeve move down the arm with the fullness tending to be sort of at the bottom. And by the time we get to the 1850s, we're going to see all the fullness at the bottom. Okay, so remember this, everybody loves this dress, so I brought it back one more time, why not? But this reminds us of where we are in that kind of most simple form of the empire. And here we can see how we have started to add volume at the bottom. And here we're starting to take that step out of the empire into the romantic. Can you see how the sort of shoulders or the edge of the collar, I guess you could say, or the opening has started to move down onto the ball of the shoulder. And then the sleeves have started to balloon out, round out. And even in this case, we see an empire line, or that higher line with that belt or that thick waistband. But you can see how it's kind of moving into a double waistband era. And then when you look at the bottom, notice all that detail, all that cording, all that trim and detail that really puts emphasis on a more triangular skirt. Now, how do they do this? Well, part of it is through, in this romantic world, adding volume through structures, right? We had talked about support, and we see a very similar support that we had mentioned before, this idea of the stay. It looks very similar to the stay we saw before, but now we're going to add structures. And here on the shoulders, which we'll see plenty pictures of, so don't think this is it, but we can see a structure to hold the sleeves into position. Now, unfortunately, this era is one of my favorite eras. And when I went on sabbatical in 2010, I had done with my white project, which you've seen many, many versions of, a replica of 1830s, a whole outfit. So it from shift, the stay or the corset, the start of this, the sleeves and these petticoats, and then the gown itself and all the pieces. So unfortunately, I usually, I can show you in front of you, but unfortunately I can't do that because that's at school and I'm trapped in my craft room in my basement. But you can see how we're starting to develop a silhouette. Notice this petticoat. What we're looking at here is what we call a corded petticoat. The idea of the corded petticoat is that it is, just as we might think of a petticoat, a rectangle of fabric. But if you notice, there are cords, cotton cords that are sewn into it to create kind of ribs all the way around. And these are just like laundry line or rope, cotton rope. The reason that they would do this, you can see how it's going to push it out, right? But also, if you starched this, those cords would absorb the starch and be even more rigid. Well, they also, because we're dealing with some technology at the time, started weaving cord into textiles as well to make an easier sort of cotton corded petticoat. And at school, I have one where the cords are actually woven into the textile. Here we can see a few other versions showing us, again, all those layers. First, we see the shift, then we see the stay, then we see these plumpers, in this case, made out of something less formal, more like a pillow, right? Filled with down and such. And then we can see the corded petticoat, in this case, done with a series of tucks and cords to give volume to the skirt. And so here we see, and this is 1826, that movement into that romanticism. Do you notice how the sort of upper chest where the décolletage might be, that filler has a series of horizontal lines which add breadth to the shoulders. And we're seeing those shoulders slope off of the actual shoulder into a sleeve that really starts at the ball of the shoulder, but very, very full. So we had called these sleeves in the past, Lego mutton sleeves. And certainly that's where they're drawing them from. They're drawing them from that Elizabethan historicism. But in this period, we tend to call them, and we still do call them, Jigos sleeves. And that's spelled, and that's in the lecture notes, Gigot. And those have, as you can see, very, very full upper parts tapering down to some degree to the wrist. And then here we can see the skirt being very, 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 full, starting to create that triangular. It does have to do with this sort of mental return. I think it's in the video that I had enclosed in there. But after all of the chaos of revolutions, and you have to remember that the French Revolution is still happening in some ways. We have a short return to the monarchy, but then, people are like, no, we don't want the monarchy. And the French have a series of revolutions that continue throughout the 30s and 40s. And in fact, when people go see Les Miserables and they think of the French Revolution that is there, they're often thinking of the one at the end of the 19th century, the 18th century, but in truth, it is during this period. It is during the Romantic period that we see these things. So they're kind of wanting to return, as you say, Daisy, to traditional values. And it really does create that sort of sense of the Victorian era as we know it, right? And you can see here by 1830, it has really reached an incredible volume. And you can see how those sort of supports and those structures would be incredibly important to developing this silhouette. Notice also that the skirt has started to lift up. Now, these are fashion plates, and we see, the extremity in fashion plates, just like you might see in, Vogue, those very high-end clothes that you go, who would wear that? But it's, the fashion is for a slightly shorter skirt. Here, these seem exceptionally short, right? And even if this may move fast, so forgive me, but even if we look at, this sort of silhouette, you could see in these parodies, they're really mocking that these skirts are super short, that they are, at levels we don't even really see today in some cases. But it seems so scandalous that they are short. But in some cases, it's probably because so full, people are getting used to sort of walking around and having a little bit of movement. But almost as soon as they come to the to a higher level, they will drop back down. Hold on a second, Alana. I'm going to try to move the chat. Actually, can you unmic, because I can't see the entirety of it?
Yeah, so I wanted to know how shoes are doing during this time, especially since the hems are shorter. I'm curious how the shoes, like if that affected anything with the fashion.
Oh yeah, because before we were in the land of slippers and we would, sort of play with those. But notice now our emphasis is going to be on the shoes, right? We're going to see a slide coming up where we see a variety of different shoes. They're still in the land of straights, meaning that the left and the right are cut the same, but they will get more decorative. And even if on the figure on the right, you can see that there's that ballet lacing that I was talking about, and that's going to be more emphasized in its detail. The figure on the left is actually wearing a boot in which The entire foot is enclosed, but then it has a little bit of an extension up, in this case, both made of satin. So you can see how those are, our shoes are going to be have a lot of emphasis. We can even see in this case, coats and such are going to follow the same silhouette. So here we see the very rounded triangular shoulder moving into that very full Jigos sleeve and that very full skirt. Notice that the bonnets as well are creating this highly romantic silhouette around the face, almost to the degree of creating a halo around the face. Here we see evening wear. Now, for evening wear, we really start this idea of bare shoulders for evening. But again, notice how this, even though it is a dropped shoulder, do you notice how it's sitting on that bone that I had mentioned before, that I had everybody sort of touch? You could see that it's really hitting just there. We're not at that point of seeing the crevice. But everything that would be there has sort of moved off that shoulder as well. So that sort of opening, that sort of V shape has, moved out as well to create as much of a diamond as possible. We could notice that the shorter sleeves are still here for evening, and then notice the evening gloves, right? So that's really informing us. Then we can see that skirt with the rows and rows and rows of both pleats and detailing, helping to horizontally create a silhouette, a kind of a visual silhouette, but also to help keep that skirt as rigid as possible. And here, Alana, look at those shoes. So what's really fun, if you took first semester, you'll remember when we looked at the Byzantium, we saw a very similar shoe that was just the very tip of the toe and then the cap of the heel with then the lacing tied in. If we look at these today, we might almost think of what we call spectators, right? A two-tone shoe where you have the toe and the heel of one color and then the body is of another. In this case, this would literally be the smallest little whisper of a bit of shoe that you could strap on your foot. Notice the hairstyle too. Ridiculous, right? But these are modeled on, inappropriately in some ways, but kind of Asian hairstyles, specifically styles that were seen in Chinese paintings. And so this was often called chinoiserie, or what was the word? There was another word specifically for this hairstyle. I think it was called like the hairstyle de Chine or such. But notice that it is romantic as well, almost coming back to that idea of the poof and all those things that we saw in the Rococo and into the Revolution. But this is how I really like to think of these clothes. Now, this is from 1835, and you can see that it is pretty simple, though this has all the hallmarks of a romantic dress. You can see that it is, a bodice, a full sleeve tapered to the wrist. We can see the belt around the waist, or a wide waistband, and then the simple skirt. What I really love about this portrait is, if you notice the neckline, and this may be the deep dive that I'm so is so popular with me in some of these things, but notice how the dress looks like it's been pushed down a little bit, right? Can you see the pleating that goes into the center front? Do you notice how it's kind of buckling out a little bit? If it was worn kind of a little bit higher, you could see how that would sit more flat on the body, right? But she's, having her painting painted, she wants to look more fashionable. It kind of looks as though she's pushed it down just a little bit so that she can have much more of that décolletage. And notice how those shoulders feel incredibly triangular. Here we see a dress, and notice how Yeah, exactly. It is kind of like those, high school prom off the shoulders, but it's still dangerously close. Here we're seeing kind of a mixture of the bodice, which feels just a little bit like the Empire with that gathering, or even with the gown à la reine. But notice that it has that very high waist in kind of an inverted basque front, right? And then we have the second waist that is closer to the true waist. Notice those sleeves, incredibly large. And you can see kind of a 1980s quality, I guess you could say, with some of these ideas. But then notice inside, you can see just a little bit of the edge of the gown running from shoulder to shoulder. Then you can see a second piece in there. Now we'll see a couple images coming up, but that more than likely is that chemisette, or what was called a tucker as well, which would be like a little fake shirt that you would insert into your neckline, just like the fichu, but it has much more of a structured quality to it. Notice the big pom-poms of curls on each side, and then her cap sort of gives her that sweetheart shape, which we saw in the Elizabethan, right? So here we're seeing references to a lot of classic styles. Here's just the simplest calico dress, but notice that it is following all of the design lines of the Romantic. Notice the huge sleeves. Notice the double waistline still moving, as it will do throughout the course of this whole period, slowly moving from under the bust and that double waistline into a thicker double waistline to eventually hit a lower waistline. And you can see how you would need all of those things to change that silhouette. And here we're starting to move from the 1830s, slowly marching away into the 1840s. And you can see how that bodice is slowly going to return back to a much more fitted bodice. If you look, you can see a double waistline in this. Can you see how there's kind of a belt almost built in? But that is eventually going to sort of disappear to favor that longer basque front bodice that we tend to love. Notice how the bodice décolletage is cut in a way to emphasize the shoulders, and we're going to see it sort of move down to the shoulder, then back up eventually, but still these very large balloon sleeves, and we can understand how we would need things underneath. And notice that beautiful necklace sort of coming down, tacked to the left-hand side and then returned up. I had mentioned that idea of chatelaines in the lecture, and chatelaines were this idea of attaching things to you. And in this case, that little circle that you see there could be a locket, or it could be a very small watch. But chatelaines could have books attached to them. They could have sewing kits, all sorts of things to keep it right at your side. And here we see, again, I tend to focus on the 1830s because it is so inflated and so gorgeous and so crazy. But look at this from the back. You can see how much volume is packed into this, including those sleeves. And because we can see the shaping at the waist, you get some volume there. But notice how this has a collar in it that emphasizes that horizontal as well. This is, as I said, a favorite of costume designers in a lot of ways because it is so theatrical, but there are very few plays that find themselves in this land. So here we're seeing a day dress, and this dress comes with what we call a pelerine. And the idea of the pelerine is a cape, and capes were much more popular in this period, in some ways even over coats, because they could accommodate the volume that was there, but it also adds to the triangularity. And notice that the bodice is, as we might say, curiously cut with a very interesting sort of pleated dimension happening there, sort of reaching over each other. And then look at these sleeves that are tied off into segments. And that is called a Marie sleeve, spelled just like Marie Antoinette, which were, again, using little ties all the way around. And in some circles, these have a very different name, which references asylums, which I'm not going to tell you that name, but because it's kind of awful. But you can see how we're sort of influenced by this idea of the mind and taking reference from things like straitjackets or needing to be bound together. It's very interesting. But we see this idea of Marie sleeves, or as we call it in the Renaissance, Finestrella, sort of playing into the world as well. Here we can see a dress that actually has the pelerine cut into it. So this has this added sort of capelet built into the whole garment. And then, as you can see, it's really kind of visually pushing the shoulders down almost up level. And then you can see a collar in cotton or linen that has been added, and you can see a very similar style to the rabat collar from the Cavalier period in this, right? Creating, again, that diamond-shaped bodice. And then notice that very ornamental belt, really drawing your eye to those two waistlines. It's really, it's so fun. Here we can see a dress, and there's a little special detail in this dress. If you look really carefully, and I'm going to stop the share just for a couple seconds here, just because I want to blow it up so you can really see the detail here. Boop, boop, boop. Okay. If you notice, can you see that there's sort of a capelet happening here, but then it comes down, right? It comes down into, I'm going to move the chat over just a little bit, into these little tabs that hang down in front. So if you remember that idea of the fichu, the scarf, right? This is a combination between a capelet, which we're calling the pelerine, right? And the scarf, which we call the fichu, and that joins together to be called the fichu pelerine or the pelerine fichu. And you can see it's sort of has these hangsy downsies, I guess you could call them, these tabs in the front that can get secured underneath the belt to hold it taut, but also to add sort of shape into the whole thing. So that section there we call the pelerine fichu. And then we can see that beautiful sort of belt in there as well. Let's keep going, keep going. Oh, I moved the picture altogether. And even in some way, I look at this as being kind of a modest sense of the romantic. The silhouettes are extreme compared to what we've seen, but it does feel a little bit more on a human body. It's not quite as fashionable. And I say that in all the best ways. It's not pushing, that's what I should say, the overtly fashionable silhouette. It's really working naturally. And you can see there's kind of a roundness to it. There's a fullness of the skirt. And here is probably where most women would feel comfortable raising their skirts, just to the sort of instep of the foot. But notice the emphasis on the detailing of those shoes. And here we can see yet another sort of style as well. And I, incorporate the men's clothes right next to this so you can see where we're going to land as far as the silhouette is concerned there. We look at this coat with the coat underneath it, and we can see that this is, a very similar silhouette, rounded through the bust or the torso, and then moving into a very, very, very skirted coat. And then you can notice the trousers as well, sort of pegged down with that little inset. But we're going to see more of that coming up. Don't worry. So here we see a variety of different sleeve plumpers. And one of the most common was the one that's like the second over, which is really just a pillow. You know, we had talked about this idea of bombast and such, and really anybody could take a piece of cloth and stuff it in with almost anything to lend some support or structure to those sleeves. The most popular often was down, which are feathers. Obviously, we still, maybe some of you sleep with down pillows, right? The reason was because those arm sizes are so narrow, you would want something that was incredibly lightweight, but could also sort of shrink down so you could stuff it through the arm's eye into the sleeve itself. And in most cases, with all four of these that you see, those would attach directly to the strap of the stay. So you would put it onto the stay first, then you'd get dressed and stuff those in. But you can see the ones that are all the way on the left and all the way on the right, that those feel very much like the pannier that we saw, where they have a piece of boning in them to keep them incredibly rigid. And again, here we go, the sleeves curiously cut. I love that, curiously cut, and showing just the silliness of everything that fashion is sort of saying. There's the villainy. I love curiously cut. Just makes me giggle. Anyway, as we move along, about 1833, 34, 35, you're going to see the weight of the sleeves, meaning the fullness of the sleeves, start to move down the arm. So if you notice right where the ballooning started, the Jigos sleeves started, now that's going to get closer to the arm, and then it's going to release at the elbow or mid-arm, and then come into the sleeve. And slowly as the period moves along, it's going to get lower and lower. So by the time we're in the 40s, it's really going to be all emphasis on the forearm. Oh, love this painting. Guess who this is, folks? My favorite painter from the Empire. Who's going to give it a try?
Is it? Did I say it right?
It's close. Now you're going to make me cough. That was so lovely. Oh, that made my day. Ingres. And here's one of his later paintings. And you can see again how the emphasis is sort of moving off the shoulder. I'm howling too. I love it. And if you look in the mirror, you can see the back, you can see the roundness and the movement off the shoulder, and then the emphasis at the upper part. And we could tell this is probably an evening gown or a dinner gown because the sleeves are short. But yes. So here, now we're looking at the movement, you know, like we're really going to move now through the 30s into the 40s. And can you see how the bodice is going to return back to that basque front bodice that we love so much? We still see, in some cases, kind of an empire or an underbust reference, where we're going to see some softness coming to the underbust, but then very fit. Again, sort of in that revolution / directoire style, with the feeling of the, oh, I lost a sticky, the feeling of the fichu into a bodice, but now we're really going to return back to the fitted bodices as we know them. And notice all the fullness has moved down the arm. So now we're in a sleeve that is fit from the shoulder to the elbow, say, and then a bit of volume, which we'll get a term for next time. But I love this dress too. And we're going to see another one coming up that hopefully will make you scream because it's so beautiful. But do you notice that like the fullness is captured at the shoulder, then released around the bosom, and then it's captured again underneath the bosom, creating a series of pleats into the basque. I just love that. But the one thing that will stay with us for a while is the idea of the full skirt. Here we can see an evening gown from the period. And you notice again how we're still going to have some roundness through the bust, but we're going to move back into that idea of the basque front bodice. And we can see here that this is made in a beautiful, beautiful silk satin. And we can see even the sleeves being short are sort of following that same principle where we want fit at the top, and then the bottom allows a little bit of poof, right? But we can tell this is getting later because of that bodice. And we can even see a little bit of the cavalier in this. If you notice in the sleeve, we see that rosette, which feels very kind of cavalier in some ways. Ugh, that's a terrible picture. Okay, because we're going to go to the one that I love. Look at this. So the one on the right isn't, or left isn't quite as high resolution as I would love, but notice the detail here on the right. So this is a gown, and if you notice, it does physically move from the shoulders into this front section, to which it has been pleated and then sewn together to create this kind of honeycomb detail. So does some people still do this sort of craft? Does anybody know the name of it, where you make pleats in fabric and then tack them at intervals? No one? Okay. Well, we call it smocking. And you'll often see it on children's clothes. There'll be sometimes like right at the bodice section, you'll see a series of pleats that have been joined together into this kind of honeycomb detail, and then it's released into the skirting of the top. But this one is exceptional for so many reasons. Not only, first of all, notice how they play with proportion, right? They started at the top in this very large diamond, and then slowly as it moves down, do you see how it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller? It's emphasizing that. It's playing into the body as something we've understood, which was kind of that stomacher quality, right? And then it has such a low, deep basque. It's very similar to the Elizabethan style. You can notice that the skirt is still very full. And one of my favorite things in this illustration, notice right below the pocket watch, right below the basque front, you can see that cartridge pleating, which we had talked about in the Elizabethan period, where you fold, 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 and sew it vertically to a waistband, because you can pack a ton of fullness into that. But just a beautiful gown. The last thing I want you to notice, this is what we call shot silk, right? It's where you weave two different colors of silk together, and together they kind of make a general color. But in this case, it's purple and gold woven together, and you kind of get a brownie undertone when they meet. But because it moves, it really emphasizes all of these little details. If you notice on the join of the skirt, you can see every single little pleat. And then here around her neck, we can see the chatelaine, in this case with a pocket watch. And just like the sleeves, those bonnets, which were really full, are going to start to move into a very close fit to the head. And here we can see kind of that return. Here 1845, we can see almost a cavalier / restoration return, right? We see some hallmarks of that world, but we notice that the bodice itself is so much more rounded through the bust. And by the end of the 1840s, this is kind of where we live. And it sits in this place very quickly. It's not, I hate to say this, it's not the most attractive, but it will sort of reevaluate and rethink itself into a much more physically embodied style. But you can see almost as quickly as it inflates, it deflates, because we're going to get into this realm of fashion. What is the fashionable silhouette? And by the time we get to the end of the 1840s, into the 1850s, we're really going to start to see a silhouette that is much more rounded and much more full. Now, again, with these silhouettes, one of the challenges is, making tailored garments to go over them. And so things like cloaks, as I said before, pelerines and capes really become the most fashionable outerwear. Sorry. Wedding dresses. So quick little bit of wedding dress lore that happens here is this is the era in which the white wedding dress becomes the fashionable wedding dress. And it is one of the many ways that Queen Victoria has had an impact on us, because she wore a white wedding dress. So it sort of stayed as the color for wedding dresses predominantly for the rest of the world. Well, not the rest of the world, because we see many different colored wedding dresses all over the world, but we do see that influence in wedding dresses today, I should say, or those styles. And it sort of sets the tone for the volume of a wedding dress as well, right? That even though they're fashionable lines for a wedding dress, it still can feel to this degree, this layer of volume, whether it's the skirt or the fit of the bodice and such. So one of the many things that Queen Victoria is going to sort of influence in the world. And here we see yet another winter halter painting. Again, look at this. It's almost hard to tell where one period starts and another period stops and how it all plays out, because it's like a little bit of Rococo and a little bit of Cavalier and a little bit of Restoration. But really, really interesting. And, this is sort of where we'll leave it. You can see that color and texture are going to play an important role in how we look at clothes. And if you notice the first two, both the green and the pink, we get kind of a return in some ways of shepherdess ideas. Look at the pink one. You can see sort of that lacing down the front that feels very similar to the stuff that we saw in the Rococo. So here's some shoes. Now, not super interesting, but you can notice all the colors and all the details, and shoemaking becomes such an incredibly important style, or not style, craft, I guess you could say. We certainly do love a good shoe moment. And you can see how the toes, there are going to be fashionable shapes in the toes, whether it's that block toe or the rounded toe, or eventually the point toe. And so, heels are going to come back, so don't panic here. Here we can see that kind of romantic silhouette in the hair too. This idea of we had the curls that were just on the side. Now they're going to sort of evolve back out to where we saw them in the Restoration, with these curled dog ears, and then this big bun on top that will sort of jump up into the bun a la Sheen. Here we can see a coat, and in this case, with this coat, we can see a pelerine that is cut into it, but also the fashionable sleeve as well, and then that belt that is in there. So you can see a lot of things are going. But I wanted to remind you of that bonnet that is 1830s, right? This very sort of rounded, framing the face bonnet, which will slowly change into a much more conical style bonnet. And this bonnet was called the poke bonnet because you kind of had to poke your face into the bonnet to see who was in there. It's sort of, your face was hidden to some degree, and you can imagine, sort of like blinders on a horse, it would really limit your viewing. Okay, so that was our women. Back to the men. Boring, 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 right? All we see is that movement in a lot of ways, from the tailcoat being the most fashionable to the frock coat, though we will still see the tailcoat in there, mostly relegated to evening wear. And then the takeover of trousers, where trousers will be basically what we'll wear for the rest of the, the 20th century, or the 19th century into the 20th century. And we're going to see them taper, then get full, then taper, then full, then taper. And really, it's how these things fit on the body that changes. The last thing I want you to notice here is notice how our neckwear is going to formalize or change from that white cravat into more of a separate piece that will eventually become the thing that I'm wearing around my neck now, just a regular tie, and will be a separate color often than our neckwear. The collars will still stand, but we'll start to see them slope down into a falling band collar. And pretty much the only place that men will have color will be in their neckwear and in their waistcoats. So remember where we were? Here we are. Bang! I try to crack it in as much as I possibly can, but we see from the empire, from the Regency, this idea of the high collar that is hitting right to the sideburns. We see the cravat, the white cravat tied around. We see the waistcoat with its high stand collar. We see the M revere of the tailcoat, and then we see the overcoat as well. And in his hand, he's carrying his bicorn. But slowly from these coats, these military coats, we're going to get eventually this idea of the frock coat. And here we can see how the idea, romantic idea, is going to change, where everything sort of sits just at the jaw, and we're going to get into a rounded shape through the chest, into a skirted shape through the hip. Now, why I also love this illustration is we start to see the idea of mustaches come back and different types of facial hair stories, which really plagued the Victorian era for men. It is a very, at times, silly facial hair thing, but for men, the facial hair becomes kind of one of the few things that changes up their look. Notice again the black cravat around the neck, almost tied in the way that a bow tie might be today. Notice the waistcoat in blue, so a little bit of color there, but then over it is that black coat. And notice now we're really in the land of a lapel, right? The collar is now joining to the revere to create that single unit that sort of moves from the center back down into the front of the jacket. And again, that's why tailoring is so important. Here we can see a very fashionable young man moving from tailcoats into sort of frock coats. We could see how those tails are kind of flipping out to some degree, not flipping out like we're all flipping out right now, but this idea of fitted to the waist and then sort of rounding out. But look at his trousers. They basically look like leggings, right? Very fit. And then you can see that they come down, taper to the ankle, and then they have the stirrup that goes outside of the shoe. And those shoes look very similar to a woman's shoe. Here we can see that romantic silhouette. This gentleman still kind of carrying on with the tailcoat, right? But notice how we're getting that roundness through the body and a roundness through the hip, tapering down in those trousers to that stirrup. Notice the waistcoat starting to get rounded and lower with then some decoration in there. And then we can see that the cravat is really limited to right around the neck. Those are some tight pants. So here's a great illustration. We have very few of these, but you can see in these trousers that they actually have kind of a built-in stay, right? That you would draw them and it would sort of wrap it around your body. And it wasn't unknown for men in this period to wear stays, or as we'll call them, corsets, to really reshape that body into that rounded silhouette. And if we think about this guy, you know, there's no panty lines there, right? You've got to be really careful because these are so tight and so fit to the body. But I love that little illustration. Here we can see about 1832, I want to say. We could see those pieces sort of coming together with the tailcoat, but notice that the sleeve is starting to round out, very much like we saw in the women's clothes. And then notice the trousers to help us give some volume. We've added pleats in across the front. Now, many of you probably have no reference to this, and forgive me for it. However, when I was your age and in high school, probably about 16 or 17, one of the biggest fashion fads of the 80s were these trousers that had a ton of pleats across the front of them. And sometimes they're referred to as Z Cavarici pants. But they would be very full at the hip and then taper right down to the ankle. And we loved them. We loved them so much. But you can understand how, even in the case of this, that lacing or that fit around the back would be important. And then you could see how they taper right down to the ankle, and then they have that instep of the stirrup. Look at these waistcoats. They're fabulous, but this is pretty much the only place that we can have anything that is super fancy. You know, we kind of relegate boring colors to the jacket and to the trousers. And the only place we can really have some fun is in the waistcoats. But notice these very rounded reveres, these rounded lapels. And here we can see a beautiful waistcoat of silk with a little bit of detail, but everything else is kind of boring. Though we have that beautiful sort of burgundy polka dot cravat there, which is kind of fun. And here we can see, you know, both the tailcoat and the frock coat living amongst each other in the world. So don't think that those tailcoats are going to go too far, but that frock coat really becomes the most fashionable coat. And you can see how it is very similar to the shape of the dress that we saw for women. We can see the front sort of lowering and rounding out. We'll see just a whisper of the waistcoat. And in fact, sometimes people didn't even wear two waistcoats because those waistcoats would add volume at the chest and then taper down to the waist. And then we can see these great plaid trousers, right, that come right down and buckle underneath the instep. Here we see another frock coat, very romantic. Notice how full that skirt is. And also notice how full the sleeves are, right? So rounded, so full, adding to that romantic silhouette.
I pound.
I'm sorry?
You have not entered any numbers. Please re-enter your meeting ID followed by pound.
Thanks, Jordan.
You have not entered any numbers. Please re-enter your meeting ID followed by pound.
Oh, goodness. Got to do this.
Goodbye.
There we go. Goodbye.
David, you're muted.
I know. I just moved between two screens and it wouldn't do the thing I needed to do. Okay. Anyway, we're back. Thank you for catching that. So here we can see again that roundness. It is a little awkward, but we're again playing with all these things to get us to a point where we understand menswear. And notice how the trouser in this case sort of fits to the ankle, but then flares out. And we could see a bit of a heel on it as well. Notice the very silly facial hair, right? In this case, the sort of beards that ride underneath the chin. And then in the center guy with his little mustache. But notice his hair looks very much like the women's hair that we saw before. And then these toppers, notice how cylindrical they are. And that top hat isn't just for riding anymore. It becomes the gentleman's hat, right? It becomes the hat of that a gentleman would wear, as well as for business. And we're going to talk a little bit more about toppers and top hats next time. Obviously very frocky, right? Very frock coaty. So we can see different versions of it. One in a single breasted, more outerwear because of the fur trim that we see on it. But then next to it, we see a double breasted version as well. And here we can see an illustration of two servants helping a gentleman get ready. And we can see that they're pulling on this corset or this stay to give him the silhouette that is needed. Even maybe going so far as adding hip pads and ankle pads to really round out the silhouette, and then adding shoulder pads to things. And that's why, you know, tailors would be incredibly important to help us build these things into the clothes and not letting us sort of get caught up in it. Okay, I think that is it. Oh, one more. I'll just show it to you quick. And here we see the toppers or the top hats, and we're going to have varying sort of cylindricality to them. They're going to change back and forth, different brims and such. But notice how the cravats in this case are really, really, really being tied just as we might a bow tie. Okay. And there we are, Le Romantique. I know it goes quick, and I know we sort of, this is one of the better, I have to tell you the truth, the better lectures that we can kind of zoom through because it is so beautiful. But in the big picture of fashion history, it just kind of is more of a transition.